In this video, I'm gonna give you a complete breakdown of the Texas rig. This is by far one of the best techniques, whether you are just getting started in bass fishing or you've been fishing your entire life. A Texas rig is extremely versatile and it catches fish everywhere. Now, I've broken this video down into 5 different sections. We're first gonna quickly go over how to set up a Texas rig. Then we're gonna talk about my top 5 Texas rig combos, the weight and the bait that I use the most when I'm out there fishing. Then we're gonna talk about how to fish a Texas rig deep. What is my favorite plastic to catch big ones in deeper water or off the bank? Then we're gonna talk about the best Texas rig technique for shallow water fish, how to catch the biggest shallow water bass in your fisheries. Then lastly, we're gonna go over the biggest Texas rig mistakes that a lot of anglers make. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by my fishing apparel company, Fin Fishing. At Fin Fishing, I have USA made sun shirts, I have hats with a wooden patch, and I have a lot of other products. And right now for the month of April, so just a couple more days, if you buy one of my USA made sun shirts, you actually get a free Fin Fishing rod glove. All you gotta do is add the shirt to cart, add the rod glove that you like to cart, it will automatically discount at checkout. Shopping at Fin Fishing is truly the best way to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. I will leave a link down below for all the products that I have. The best thing about a Texas rig is it is a very simple rig to set up and to fish. The Texas rig basically consists of a weight and a hook in a soft plastic of choice. Now, when it comes to selecting a weight size for your Texas rigs, you have weights from a 1/16 of an ounce all the way up to over 2 ounces. Now, throughout this video, I'm gonna talk a lot about where I like to use certain size weights. There are certain situations that call for bigger weights and certain situations that call for smaller weights. Now, with that being said, if you're kind of newer to the Texas rig, something in the 1/4 ounce to 3/8 ounce size is probably where you want to start with. That particular weight size, you can fish in a lot of different situations, whether you're fishing from the bank or in a boat. Now, when it comes to a hook, there are 3 main hooks that you're gonna see when it comes to a Texas rig. You have an extra wide gap hook, also known as an EWG. You have an offset worm hook, and you have the straight shank. Now, some of these hooks will fit certain soft plastics a little bit better, but for the most part, all of these hooks are fairly interchangeable. But no matter what type of soft plastic you are using, you pretty much rig up these baits with these different hooks all the exact same way. Now, there's a number of different soft plastics out there on the market, and we're gonna talk about my top 5 soft plastics I use in just a moment. But right now, I'm gonna rig up each one of these hooks on the exact same soft plastic, which is this X-Zone Adrenaline crawl. This particular crawl has become one of my favorite crawls over the last couple of months. I really love the floating material. Now, whether you're using a crawl or a worm or a beaver style bait, you all rig these almost the exact same way. You're gonna first start out by putting the point of the hook into the plastic. Now, typically I'm gonna put that hook about 1/4, at most about 1/2 inch into the plastic, and then I'm gonna poke it out the side. The next thing you're gonna do is feed that soft plastic all the way up the hook. And as I do this, I like to rotate the hook 180 degrees. Now, with an EWG hook or the offset worm hook, there is a little notch in the hook for the plastic to sit. Now, with a straight shank hook, there's typically some sort of plastic keeper like this Trocar TK130 has. I would not suggest using a straight shank that doesn't have some sort of plastic keeper on it. The next thing you're gonna do is see where the end of that hook lines up on your soft plastic. This is gonna be where you feed that hook through the soft plastic. Now, with the EWG hook and the offset worm hook, I'm going to Texpose the hook, meaning I'm gonna push that hook all the way through the soft plastic and then barely take some plastic and cover up the tip of that hook. Now, when you're fishing the straight shank hook, I actually like to leave that straight shank kind of buried in the plastic, but I am going to make sure that the tip of that hook is just below the plastic. And what I actually like to do is actually break through the plastic to kind of give that hook a path to follow when you set the hook on a fish. Once you do this, you have completed your Texas rig. You have a weight with your hook and a soft plastic. Now, one thing that you should know is sometimes you want to peg your weight, meaning you want that weight to not separate from your plastic. In order to do this, you're actually going to want to use a bobber stop. A bobber stop is going to be the first thing you put on your line before you put the weight and before you put the hook. A bobber stop prevents the weight from leaving the bait. This will really help that weight to stay with the bait as you're bringing it through nasty cover. Now, you may be asking, well, shouldn't I just always peg the weight then? And I'm gonna be 100% honest with you. I have seen through the years that if you can get away with not pegging your weight, you tend to get a lot more bites. When you have a little bit of separation between the weight and that plastic, the plastic just moves a little bit more freely, it falls a little bit more freely, and that tends to trigger more bites, especially when you're fishing around highly pressured situations. Now, there's probably 728,542 different soft plastics out there on the market, so you may be asking, Tyler, what soft plastic should I use? And now we're gonna talk about my top 5 favorite soft plastic baits to use on a Texas rig. The first Texas rig that is one of my absolute favorites is the Missile Baits D-Bomb. Now, the D-Bomb is kind of that beaver style bait, and this bait is my go-to bait whenever I am flipping and pitching cover, whether that's lily pads or reeds, or if I'm fishing it around docks or wood cover. Most of the time that I am fishing this bait, I'm fishing it on a 1/4 ounce to a 1/2 ounce, with 3/8 probably being my favorite. And whether I select a 1/4 ounce or a 1/2 ounce or a 3/8 really comes down to a number of different things. That could be water temperature, that could be the depth of the cover that I'm fishing, and sometimes it's just what the fish want. If you kind of get on a flipping and pitching bite, sometimes I like to experiment with weight sizes to see which one the bass actually like the most. Now, the reason that I like the D-Bomb over some of the other beaver style baits is actually because of the ribs that are on this bait. The ribs kind of give this bait a little bit of a bigger presence in the water. So sometimes I feel like I can get a bigger bite with this bait. But the other thing about the ribs is that there's not a whole lot of plastic that is on this bait. And I really feel like I get a good hookup ratio with this soft plastic over some of the other beaver style baits. As far as color goes, I really keep things pretty simple. Usually it's some sort of dark color and some sort of natural color. So whether that's a black and blue or just a black neon color like I'm holding right here. And then my natural color is going to be something like green pumpkin blue flake, or watermelon. If I'm fishing on cloudy days or in muddy water, I'm typically going to use those darker baits, while if I'm fishing in clear water, I'm going to use that more natural colored bait. I personally like a straight shank hook with the D-Bomb. This is a 4/0 Trocar TK130 hook. All right, the next Texas rig is probably my favorite, although I feel like I've said that about every one of these, and that is the Zoom Old Monster worm. This is absolutely one of my favorite ways to catch a bass, is fishing this big worm, this Zoom Old Monster. It's a 10.5 inch worm. And anytime I am fishing kind of off the bank, whether I'm fishing around hydrilla that is offshore, or maybe it's a brush pile offshore, or a shell bottom or a rock bottom, I love dragging a Zoom Old Monster. I was actually using this exact setup several years ago fishing on Lake Chickamauga, where I got 4th place in a Bassmaster Open down there fishing this exact worm. This is actually my favorite color in the Zoom Old Monster, which is plum, but there's a lot of good colors. I like plum, I like green pumpkin, I like June bug. But anytime I'm kind of fishing off the bank, or anytime I'm fishing in the summertime, I pick up the Zoom Old Monster a lot. This is also a great bait to use in ponds during the summer as well. Now, typically when I'm fishing the Zoom Old Monster, I like it on 15-pound fluorocarbon line. And the hook that I like to use with this bait is an offset worm hook. I believe this one here is an owner hook. The big thing when you're fishing a big worm like this is a lot of guys tend to want to put this hook way down here. And if you do that in your fishing, it just leads to a lot of frustration because you're gonna scrunch up the top of this worm. So you do not have to put a hook way down here. As you can see, I leave about a 1/2 inch and then I pop that hook out, and I hook up with fish even in Ohio where I'm fishing for like 1 pound fish a lot of times. So anytime you're fishing in the summer, anytime you're fishing offshore, do not forget about that Zoom Old Monster. The next Texas rig that I have caught a ton of fish on is the Zoom Speed Crawl. The Zoom Speed Crawl has been around for forever, and there's been thousands of bass caught on this bait. Now, something else that I really like about a Zoom Speed Crawl is I actually love it on a Carolina rig, and I also like it on the back of a jig as a jig trailer. So the Speed Crawl has multiple different purposes, but I absolutely love this bait when I am fishing a Texas rig. Now, specifically, something that I do a lot with the Zoom Speed Crawl is, as you can see here, I will flip the Zoom Speed Crawl with a big weight in matted vegetation. Across the country, whether you live up north in New York or down south in Florida, you're gonna have mats of vegetation in lakes, rivers, and ponds. I absolutely love targeting mats because a lot of times some of the biggest fish that are in the body of water that you are fishing are going to be up underneath of those mats. Now, you could flip a ton of different baits with a big weight like this, but the reason that I like the Zoom Speed Crawl is because if you pitch it in a mat, once it breaks through that mat and it goes to the bottom really quick, those little pinchers that are on the back of that bait, once it goes through the mat, are going to kick as they're going down to the bottom. And sometimes I think that that little kick coming through the mat actually can really attract a lot of fish, because if you think about it, underneath of a mat, it's typically pretty dark. Up underneath the mat, it's going to block out the sunlight, and you typically also have a dark bottom a lot of times in those situations. And so that little bit of thump as it falls through the mat, I think can sometimes help a bass hone in on that bait as it goes through the mat. Now, you could use other crawl baits that kick a little bit more, but the Zoom Speed Crawl, as you can see, it's a very compact bait. I mean, it doesn't have really big pinchers on it, so it gets through the mat very easily, where sometimes other baits can kind of hang up on the mat. Now, the next Texas rig I use a ton, and that Texas rig is a tube. Now, the reason that I use a tube so much is because my favorite place to fish a tube is anytime I am fishing around highly pressured bodies of water. Because I live in Ohio, we have a lot of smaller lakes and we have a ton of anglers. So most of the bodies of water that I fish are highly pressured. And I like to fish that tube for the simple reason that I think a lot of people don't pick up a tube anymore. And I'm gonna use this bait in a lot of the similar areas that I use that Missile Baits D-Bomb. Anytime I am flipping and pitching wood cover, cattails, lily pads, docks, whatever it may be, if I'm flipping and pitching cover, I'm going to pick up the tube. Now, if I'm fishing around vegetation, I will peg my weight like you have right here with this tube, but a lot of times, if I can get away with not pegging that weight, I will do that, because I think the tube works way better when it is not pegged. Actually, I think for most of these soft plastics, except for maybe that really big weight with the Speed Crawl, I think if you don't peg your weight, you actually get a lot more bite. Now, besides flipping and pitching cover, another place that I fish this tube a lot is kind of when I am working a steeper bank. Maybe this is a creek channel swing bank or even a bluff bank. A lot of times this is a place where I'm going to throw like a football jig, but again, because I'm fishing around highly pressured bodies of water, that's where I'm going to pick up this tube and just work it like a jig. I'm going to cast it up shallow and I'm going to work it down really deep. Now, when it comes to the tube that I like the most, it's actually this one here. This is the Strike King Coffee Flipping Tube, and the reason that I like it is it actually has a solid head on it, and that solid head just means you're not going to tear up as many tubes. The last but certainly not least when it comes to a Texas rig is some sort of soft stick bait like the Gary Yamamoto Cinco. This is a Texas rig that I'm going to throw when I literally cannot figure out how to catch a fish. Like, this is my go-to when I'm like, I can't figure them out. I don't know what to do. It's something that I just have a ton of confidence in. It doesn't have a ton of action down there under the water, but bass, as you guys probably know, absolutely love a Cinco style bait like the one that I have right here. Now, I guarantee that those 5 combos will catch you a lot of fish. Now, when I go to fish deeper water, I am typically using that bigger soft plastic worm that we talked about. This is my #1 plastic that I'm gonna use on a Texas rig in deeper water. So the next section of this video, I'm gonna talk to you all about the big worm and how I utilize it to fish off the bank and in deeper cover and structure. One of the best ways to catch big summertime bass is with a big worm. And the big worm is a very easy technique. You can catch bass in ponds, rivers, lakes, no matter where you go with this worm. And so today I'm gonna break it down, so stay tuned. It's gonna be a good one. I first really saw the power of the big worm here in Ohio. I remember years ago in the middle of summer, I fished a really tough tournament where a lot of guys were fishing 3, 4, 5-inch finesse worms on shaky hits. But I decided to pick up the big worm, and I actually did really well in that tournament. I did not win it, but I did really well by fishing a lot bigger worm than most guys out there were fishing. And in this tournament, I was fishing for like 12-inch, 13-inch, 14-inch fish, not really big ones. But it just goes to show you that if you can catch them in a tough fishery like Ohio, you can catch them anywhere. And I actually did just that. I fished the big worm down on Lake Chickamauga in a Bassmaster Open, and I was actually able to get 4th place in that tournament all by fishing this big worm. And I absolutely just love this thing. It's one of my favorite techniques that there is out there. Now, probably the best thing about fishing a big worm is that it is extremely easy to rig up and to fish. I want to talk quick about how to rig this worm because there are a few mistakes that I see a lot of anglers make when rigging this worm. My favorite big worm to fish is this Zoom Old Monster. This is a 10.5-inch worm. The reason that I like it so much though is because it is skinny. Although it is 10.5 inches, it's a skinny worm. So I tend to get a lot of bites on it and I catch a lot of big fish on it. Now, I really stick with the color plum most of the time. I will throw green pumpkin from time to time, and if I'm fishing in really tannic colored water like down in Florida, I will fish a June bug. To rig this bait, you're going to tie up a simple Texas rig. You're going to slip a sinker onto the line. Now, I most of the time do not peg my weight. I like that weight to swing freely back and forth. I really believe you get more bites by not pegging the weight. I just feel like that worm just kind of glides down a little bit more naturally, which really entices a lot of fish to bite. After you slip the sinker on, you're gonna tie on your favorite big worm hook. For me, I like a 5/0 owner worm hook. Now, some guys like the EWG style hook when fishing worms. I personally do not. I just feel like my hookup ratio is a little bit better with that offset worm hook. But if an EWG works for you, then stick with it. The next step is threading that worm on the hook. And one really big mistake that I see a lot of anglers make when doing this is they put the hook too far down in the bait. A lot of guys think, hey, you know, you're fishing a 10, 11, 12-inch worm. I'm gonna get that hook further down that bait so that my chances of catching a fish when they bite it are a lot higher. And I'm gonna tell you right now that that is a mistake. And there's actually a couple of reasons why this is a big mistake. One is a bass really doesn't have an issue getting a worm like this in its mouth. When it goes to inhale that bait, a lot of times this bait is just gonna fold up into a little ball and it goes inside that fish's mouth. So they do not have an issue getting that worm in their mouth. And take it from a guy who's caught a lot of 12-inch fish in Ohio on a big worm. Also, when you put a hook really far down in a worm, what tends to happen is it will bunch at the top, and that bunch will actually twist your line a lot. When you go to cast that bait and work it or reel it in, you're gonna see your bait twisting and turning a lot. And if it twists a lot of your fluorocarbon, that's gonna lead to a lot of frustrating fishing. So when you thread the big worm on your hook, do not put that hook far down. I typically just go in about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. I'm gonna pop that hook out the top of the worm and then simply Texpose that point. To me, that is the best way to rig the worm. It's extremely straight, it comes through the cover, and I have a great hookup ratio. Now, when it comes to when I like to fish a big worm, I will fish it from the post spawn all the way through the summer. So all throughout the summer, a big worm is always tied up and on the front deck of my boat. Now, the best thing about a big worm is that you can fish it anywhere you would like. You can fish it from shallow water out to deep water. And a couple of the big areas that I really love to fish this big worm is on the outside of grass lines. If you have grass in your lake, fishing that outside grass line is a big pattern that we see a lot throughout the summer. So I like to actually cast my worm up onto the grass and kind of work that edge of the grass where a lot of bass are going to hang. This is the exact way that I caught them at Lake Chickamauga in that Bassmaster Open. Now, another one of my absolute favorite areas to fish the big worm, something that I've been doing a lot today, is fishing it in offshore brush piles. Now, this requires a little bit of work to actually go around and find these brush piles, but when you find especially isolated brush piles, you can catch some of the biggest bass in your lake with that big worm. Now, the other place that I fish the big worm a lot is on ledges. Now, sometimes a ledge will be rock, and sometimes you'll have ledges that have actually shell on them. But no matter if it's rock or shell, if there's bait fish in the area, you know, a lot of times I might start with a swim bait or a crankbait, but to really kind of clean up in that area, that is when I start dragging that big worm. And I have seen a lot of times where you will go through, you'll catch some fish, maybe on a crankbait, but you pick up that big worm and it gets you the big bite of the day. The biggest thing that I have seen while fishing this bait is don't make it complicated. The big worm is a very simple bait. Literally, when I go out and I'm fishing it, I am basically just casting it out and dragging it across the bottom. Now, sometimes if I am fishing in a little bit muddier bottom, maybe I'm fishing a stump or a brush pile that's in a muddier bottom, I will kind of do more hops, because a lot of times I've seen that bass don't like to pick that bait off a muddy bottom. So I will do a lot more hops then to kind of get that bait off of the bottom and into the brush where the bass is. But for the most part, I am simply just dragging in this bait, dragging across shell, dragging across rock, dragging it through the grass, and that is how you're going to get bit. It is not complicated. Don't make it complicated. Now, I have kind of mentioned a few mistakes that anglers make while fishing the big worm, but I want to mention quick a couple of big ones that I see a lot of anglers make. And the first one is actually the rod that they use. Sometimes I have seen guys that throw too short of a rod when fishing a big worm. And here's the deal, is that a lot of times when you are fishing a big worm, you are making a very long cast. You know, today I am positioning away from these brush piles about 100 feet away. And so if I make a 100-foot long cast and a bass bites me, you really need a longer rod to be able to drive that hook set, because most of the time I'm using straight fluorocarbon, and I usually like 15 to 17 pound fluorocarbon. And when you use straight fluorocarbon and you set the hook at a distance, that fluorocarbon is going to have some stretch. So you need a longer rod to kind of pick up some of that stretch and penetrate that fish's mouth with the hook. I really like something that is at least 7 foot 3 inches in length. That is the exact length of this Moneymaker rod. I've also used a 7 foot 6 inch in some cases. Another mistake that I also see a lot of anglers make with the big worm is using too heavy of a weight on their rig. And even though we are not pegging the weight in a lot of situations, I still feel like the lightest weight that you can get away with, the more bites that you're going to get. Now, I typically use a 1/4 to a 3/8 ounce. I probably use a 3/8 ounce most of the time, but if I am fishing shallow water, if I'm fishing 4 or 5 foot or less, I'm always going to use a 1/4 ounce, maybe even an 1/8 ounce. And if you are a pond fisherman, you're gonna wanna use a light weight. And this is the one situation where I do suggest that you might actually peg your weight, because in ponds, a lot of times you have that slime on the bottom. A lot of times using a lighter weight, a 1/4 ounce or lighter, and pegging it will help you to get that bait through that slime without too much getting hung on your big worms. The moral of the story is use the lightest weight that you can get away with when fishing the big worm. Now, the third mistake that I see a lot of anglers make actually comes down to the hook set with a big worm. And it's going to look a little bit aggressive, but I believe that setting the hook pretty hard with your big worm is really, really important. And the other thing that is really important is that when you go to set the hook, make sure you reel down and make sure you get the slack out of your bait, because there are going to be times, especially if you're fishing offshore, where that bass picks that bait up and moves towards you. And you want to make sure that you get that slack out of the line before you set the hook, because I remember when I first started fishing this bait, that happened to me several times where a bass would pick that bait up, swim towards me, and I would just set the hook, and literally I would just pop the slack out of that line. I wouldn't even get a hook in that fish at all. So it's so important to really reel down on that fish, feel the weight of that fish, and then drive the hook home. And one of the reasons that you want to set the hook hard is a lot of times when we are fishing a big worm, you are fishing it in cover that is off the bank. This might be, like I talked about, grass, a brush pile, something like that. A lot of times when you set the hook hard, you will turn that bass's face towards you, which helps him to get out of that cover. If you guys just saw, I had a bass really hung up in a brush pile, and I was able to finally get that fish out, and it was barely hooked. Even though I set the hook hard, he was still barely hooked. Now, if you don't like to set the hook hard, you can go down to a lighter wire hook, and that will help that hook to penetrate, especially at a distance. I tend to like kind of a medium, even a medium thick wire hook, because again, those fish are sometimes in heavy cover. So when I go to set the hook, I give them the bananas, I put the mustard on the hot dog, I give it to him. Now, although I absolutely love to fish that big worm out there on deeper cover and structure, probably my favorite way to actually fish a Texas rig, and probably the absolute best way to catch the biggest bass on a Texas rig, is by punching through matted vegetation. There's a number of different lakes out there in the country, even ponds, that have matted vegetation. So I really want to thoroughly go over how to flip, pitch, and punch through matted vegetation.
Still on there. There he is. Come here, Bubba.
Yes, sir. Today I'm just out here doing a little bit of punching for you guys. It's one of my favorite ways to catch them during this time of year. When you're getting into August, September, you got a lot of mats that start to develop on any lake that really has vegetation. And so punching is one of the best ways to catch them. But if you don't do a few things right when you're punching, you can miss a lot of fish or lose a lot of fish. So today we're gonna go through it all and we're gonna catch some fish. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. Now today what I'm fishing is actually what you would consider a chopped up grass mat. This is actually not vegetation that normally mats over. It's vegetation that's been chopped off over on the main lake, is been pushed in by the wind and has really compacted into mats. This is eelgrass, but this happens with pretty much every species of grass. I mean, coontail, milfoil, hydrilla, and I actually really like the chopped grass mats because there's almost always canopies under them. You will get into areas where hydrilla, coontail, it's all too thick for the bass to actually get under. But if it's chopped grass, it's floating, it's been pushed into an area, there's always a good canopy under it, and that's where you're going to catch those fish, is in that canopy under the mat.
Oh, let's go, baby.
When you're out here punching, the hook set is the #1 thing that is going to cause you to either miss fish or lose fish. And the big thing that you don't want to do on a hook set is slackline them. And slacklining means that when you go to set the hook, you drop slack in that line before you set it. Now, when you do that, you will actually pop a bass's mouth open with that big weight that we're using today. And when you pop it open just a little bit, it allows that hook to pass through without hooking into that bass, and you will miss a lot of fish. So if you noticed on that fish that I just caught, when he bit, I literally let him pull me down. I wanted that line to be tight, and then I just reared back on him. I didn't set the hook really hard either. That's the other big thing. If you set the hook too hard, because you're so close, you can also rip a big hole in that fish's mouth and you'll lose that fish. So don't slackline the hook set, make sure you're tight, and don't set the hook way too hard, and you're gonna land and catch a lot more fish on the punch rig.
There he is. Yo, let's go, baby. Let's go. Look at that. See that? I mean, just through the roof of the mouth. That is perfect. That fish will never come off if it's like that. And if you see there, it wasn't a really hard hook set. I more or less leaned into that fish, but again, on a tight line. Gosh, this is so much fun. I could do this every stinking day for the rest of my life. You know, one of the biggest things that I have found that really helps me to be a lot more successful when I'm punching mats like this is actually the way that you pump the rod. If you see here, I'm pumping the rod every time I flip, probably anywhere from about 8 to 10 times. And I just pump that rod under that mat, pump that rod, and I keep doing that. And what you will find out is that there will be days when you're out there on the water where every time you flip in there, a bass bites it on the initial fall. And you do see that a lot. And if they're biting it on the initial fall, then a lot of times you don't have to worry about pumping it 8 or 10 times the rest of the day. But if you're finding that it takes those bass a little, kind of a while to find your bait, this is a way that you can really catch bass when no one else can, because a lot of guys are going to get impatient. So if you pump that rod 8 or 10 times and that bass hits it on the 5th or 6th time, a lot of guys are going to miss those bites. They're going to pitch it in there, they're going to pump it 2 or 3 times, they're going to pull it out, they're going to move on. And there are days on the water, especially after cold fronts, when mat fishing can be really good, that you will find that every bass hits it on the 8th or 9th pump in there. So just keep that in mind when you're out there fishing mats, is that pumping that rod a lot and kind of figuring out when those bass are going to hit it is very key into catching more bass. Now, as you can see here, my punching setup is really, really simple. I have a bobber stopper, I have a 1 ounce weight, I have a 4/0 trocar flipping hook, and then I have one of my favorite soft plastics to punch with, which is a Zoom speed curl. Now, the big thing when it comes to soft plastics is you typically want something that's a little bit more small, a little bit more compact. That really just helps it to get through that mat a little bit easier without it hanging on all the vegetation. Now, anytime you are punching through matted vegetation, it's really important to tie your hook on with a snell knot. And what that snell knot does is when you set the hook on that fish, it'll kick that bait up just like that, which helps to hook that fish. You know, something that is huge in fishing in general, and I'm sure if you've been fishing for a while, you know this, is that bass almost always group together. There are so many times where you will go a long time without getting bit, and then you will hit a stretch and it's like bam, 1, 2, 3, 4. And literally that's exactly what has happened to me just here. You know, I spent about an hour this morning flipping some other stuff that didn't look great, and I got into this area and within about 5 minutes I caught one, and then about 5 minutes later I caught another one, and then about 10 minutes later I just caught that one. And that is what you see so much of the time when you are fishing, but also especially when you are fishing mats, because I've seen lakes before where it's like, man, the whole lake is just mats after mats after mats, but you will get into these small little areas where you start catching a lot of fish. So anytime you get bit, put the brakes on, really pick that area apart, and you will be surprised just how many bass you can catch in a small area. Now, one big thing that I've noticed across the country with the weight that you choose to go with is the lighter the weight that you can punch through that cover with, the more bites that you're going to get. If you can get away with using a 3/4 ounce weight to punch through a mat, then use that. If you have to have 1 1/4 ounces, 1.5 ounces just to get through the mat, then that is fine. But a lot of times the bigger weight that you use, the more problems that you will run into with hooking up and landing those fish. So the lighter weight that you can go with, the more bites you're going to get and the more fish you're going to land. One of the biggest things that people make a mistake of when they're fishing this way is really just being in a rush. You know, they're not letting that bait soak in there a lot of times as long as they should. And the other big part that they rush is really actually when they get bit. You know, you're fishing a soft plastic. Bass will hold on to a soft plastic for a while. You know, even if there's a 1 ounce weight attached to it, they'll hold on to it for a minute. So when that fish bites it, don't just, you know, react crazy. Make sure you're doing everything right to set the hook the right way so that you don't miss out on that fish, because this is a big fish technique. Like, you can catch some of the biggest bass of your lifetime doing this exact technique. That's a perfect example of exactly what I was just talking about. It was a mistake on my end, but it was a perfect example. That fish right there, I'm not sure if you saw that, but that sucker had that bait for like, I don't know, several seconds. I mean, he hung on to it. It literally, as soon as I flipped it in there, it was just dead weight. And I thought maybe it was a fish, but it was really hard to tell. And so I just kind of kept, you know, working the bait, and then he all of a sudden kind of moved off and I set the hook. I mean, he hung on to that bait for a long time there. You know, something else about that fish that I just caught is that that fish was actually at the roof of the mat. You know, a lot of times you will find that bass will be right up underneath the roof of the mat. Instead of being on the bottom under that mat, they'll be right on the underside of it. And so sometimes you will actually catch fish. This is something that I also learned from Mikey Balls, is by raising that bait to the roof of the mat and actually bouncing it on the underside of the mat. And sometimes the bass will see that and they'll come up and pick that bait on the underside of that mat and pull you down. So just always be paying attention when you're fishing this way as to where the bass are biting it. Are they hitting it on the bottom? Are they hitting it on the underside of that mat? Because keying up on that can really separate you and help you to start catching a lot more fish. Now, I just want to point out something when you're looking at these mats, because it can be a little bit overwhelming. But if you kind of look, we have this chopped up eelgrass mat right here in front of us. Now, kind of towards the edge of this stuff, it's a little bit more sparse. It's not as thick, but if you look like right up in here and right up in here, those little areas right there, it almost looks like a different color. You know, right up in there too is the same way. It almost looks like a different color. And that is where that mat is the thickest. And anywhere you have that thick mat, that is typically where those bass are going to be. So instead of, you know, flipping every square inch of it, I'm not really flipping some of this outside stuff that isn't thick at all. I'm really just concentrating my time on this thick region when it's only about 5 foot wide and it stretches all the way down here, but that is where that bass is going to be. Bass fishing is really all about the percentages. You know, if you do something better than the next guy by 10% here and 10% there and 10% over here, oh, that is exactly as I'm talking about it, I just made the biggest mistake. This is exactly what happens so much of the time. Bass fishing is all about percentages. If you can do something better than a guy, 10% here, 10% there, 10% there, that means you're gonna be 30% better than him at fishing. And I just got done talking about the hook set. That fish right there, it literally scared me. I went to pick up and he shot off and I absolutely set the hook way too hard. Like, I didn't think about it at all. I literally just made the mistake that I was talking about. And so that is what really can separate a good angler and a great angler is, yeah, I've caught 4 or 5 fish through here, but that was a 6 fish. I don't know, maybe that was a 5-pounder for all I know. And if I catch that fish, it makes a big difference. If I don't, which I obviously didn't, it also makes a big difference. So paying attention to the details is so, so critical. Woo! Gosh. Not a big one, but that fish actually just busted something right there, flipped right on top of his head, and he came up there and got it. And so, you know, one thing that's really important when you are flipping and pitching is your rod that you're using. You do not want a broom stick. I know that everyone feels like they need to have the stiffest rod they can to get these fish out, but man, if you have a stiff rod, all you're going to do is rip holes in fish, which is going to cause you to lose a lot of fish. As you can see, that fish right there, I mean, he was like 5 feet away from me. If I had a broomstick in that situation, even if I set the hook light, I'm probably gonna rip a hole in that fish and he's going to come off. This rod here is a 7 foot, 11 inch heavy power rod, fast action, but it actually has a little bit more of a parabolic bend to it. It bends a little bit further down the blank, and that's really what you want. You want a little bit more of a parabolic bend. You do not want a broomstick when you're doing this. You know, that little bit more of a parabolic bend in that rod really absorbs a lot of energy. So when you set the hook on a fish,
that rod is going to take up that energy. It's going to set the hook without it ripping big holes, and you're going to not lose as many fish. Now this particular rod is an ARC Tharp Series Guntersville special rod. I got it paired up with an 8.1-to-1 gear ratio reel and 50-pound braided line. Now before I let you guys go, I want to quickly tell you guys about the 5 biggest mistakes that anglers make while fishing a Texas rig. Now the first one is that you will see anglers, especially newer anglers, put a hook really far down in their soft plastics. You see this a lot when guys are fishing really big worms, worms that are 10 inches, 11 inches, 12 inches. I'll see guys that'll put a hook, you know, down an inch, 2 inches, 3 inches from the top of their bait at times. And while this kind of makes sense, like if you logically think about it, it's a big worm, you want to get that hook down further so that the bass maybe can get that hook when you set the hook. The reality of it is that a bass has zero problem, even a small bass, a 1-pound bass, has zero problem sucking in a 10 to 12 inch size worm, any soft plastic out there. A lot of these fish are used to eating bigger baits, whether that's bigger shad or bluegill. So they have no problem kind of getting that worm in their mouth. So it's just not necessary for you to take a hook and put it extremely far down your plastic. The other big issue with that is pretty much the first time you set the hook on a fish, it is going to rip the top of that worm completely in half, where it is pretty much unusable. So if you do that, you're gonna go through a lot of worms. You're gonna be catching one fish basically on one worm, even less than that at times, because sometimes we think we get bit, we set the hook, you ruin your worm, but you don't even catch a fish. The other thing is this will create a lot of line twists. Typically that top section that's an inch or 2 in length will actually kind of get a little small kink in it because the weight of your weight is kind of pushing down on it. And so therefore, your Texas rig is going to spin a lot in the water, which creates a lot of line twists and a lot of frustrating fishing. Now, the second big mistake that a lot of anglers make is not thinking about the gauge of their hook that they are fishing. And what I mean by the gauge of the hook is really the thickness of the hook. You know, you can rig up a lot of different Texas rigs a lot of different ways. You can also fish them on a lot of different pound tests. You know, if I'm fishing a Texas rig on 50-pound braid or even 20-pound fluorocarbon, that is really, really strong line. And typically in that situation, I'm gonna be fishing that bait on a bait casting rod and reel. And so when I set the hook, I'm gonna have a lot of power on the hook set. So I typically like a little bit thicker gauge hook in those situations because I do not want to bend that hook out on a fish. Now, vice versa, you might be fishing a really light Texas rig. Maybe you're fishing an 1/8 ounce Texas rig on a spinning rod. And in that situation, you typically can't have as much power on the hook set because you're using more finesse tackle. So I do not want to use a big gauge, a thick gauge hook in that situation. Even if I'm fishing it around heavier cover, I want to use a lighter gauge hook, something that will penetrate very, very well with using that lighter tackle. Believe it or not having the right gauge hook with the tackle that you're using can just cause a lot of issues. I've seen beginner anglers that are using those thick hooks with their spinning rod and reels, and they can never get that hook fully into a fish. And so therefore they're starting to lose a lot of fish on their Texas rigs. Even though they might have the right setup, it's just not the right setup on that combo that they are using. And on the opposite end of things, if you're using a really light wire hook and you're setting the hook hard with heavy equipment, you're gonna bend out that hook and those fish are gonna come off every single time. So make sure you think about the gauge of your hook. Now, the third mistake a lot of anglers make is not paying attention to fall rate. To me, fall rate is probably the most important aspect of our Texas rig, because there are days out there where you can be using the exact same bait as your buddy, the exact same soft plastic bait, the exact same line, the exact same hook, but your buddy may have a 1/2 ounce weight where you're using a 1/4 ounce weight. In that particular day, the fish actually may like a rate of fall that is a lot quicker. They may actually be reacting to that fast falling lure a lot better than a slow falling lure. So therefore, he may be catching a lot more fish to you, even though you're fishing the exact same bait. It's all about rate of fall. The exact same thing happens kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum though too. Sometimes you're fishing too heavy a weight. Sometimes you only need a lighter weight, and actually that weight falling slower helps you to get more bites. Now you may be sitting there and saying, well, how do I know this? And the thing that you really have to do is just experiment. Experiment with your weight size out there on the water. Now, kind of a rule of thumb for me, if I'm fishing around really highly pressured bodies of water, or if I'm fishing in a little bit colder water, I tend to like those slower falls. To me, it just seems like those slower falls will get a lot more bites in those situations. Now, if I'm fishing in warmer water in the middle of summer, or on lakes that don't get as much pressure, I can get away with those heavier weights. Those fish are aggressive and they are willing to hit those heavy weights. But again, the best thing you can do, if you get on a Texas rig bite, you know, rig up 2 or 3 of the same baits with different size weights on them to figure out if you are going to get more bites on one of those versus another. Now, mistake number 4 is not thinking about sound when it comes to your Texas rig. I know for me, this is something that I did not do for a number of years, is think about sound. And one of the best places to fish a Texas rig is in muddier water, or even in tannic water that is really dark colored. Now, with that being said, in muddy water or really dark colored water, stained water, even at night, those fish may hunt a little bit more by sound. And so adding rattles to your baits may be a huge deal. For example, if you're fishing a tube, you can actually get a little tube rattle that goes right up inside of a tube. Now, if you're not fishing a tube, a great way to add rattle to your bait is simply by using a bead. You can put a bead in between your hook and your weight, and that weight hitting against that bead constantly will just make a little clicking noise. And sometimes having a little bit of sound in those situations where you might be fishing in darker water, that can make a really, really big difference. Like a really big difference on the number of bites that you get. I remember a buddy of mine who was fishing a tube with a rattle inside of it, and he said he was able to go behind so many people that he literally saw fishing in this tournament with over 200 guys, and he would fish the exact same areas with that tube and catch a lot of fish. And he was fishing a muddy water river system. So always think about sound and how maybe sound might help you to get a couple more bites. Now, the 5th mistake a lot of anglers make, I know that I make this one all the time, is kind of getting in a rut of always using the exact same soft plastics. I like to simplify my bass fishing. So I always like to kind of fall back on certain soft plastics. So like I said, there's probably 700,000 different soft plastics out there on the market, and there might be soft plastics out there that get the job done better than the ones that I always use. Like I said, I don't always believe that, but there's just these little situations out there on the water where a certain soft plastic may mimic the bait that the bass are eating a little bit better. So therefore it gets bit a little bit better. So what I'm saying is that I think you should always explore different soft plastic. There's a ton of them out there on the market. Don't think that you can only use the 5 or 6 that I mentioned in this video. I think that if you want to simplify things, you can use those 5 or 6, but I'm not saying that if you use something different, you're doing something wrong. I'm just saying that these are the ones that I primarily use. Now, with that being said, one of the baits that I absolutely love is a Berkley Pit Boss. I didn't really talk about it a lot in this particular video, but a Berkley Pit Boss is a great bait, and I actually filmed a video of finding bass with a Berkley Pit Boss right here that I'm going to leave linked right here. So if you guys enjoyed this video, you want to watch me use a Texas rig in action, click on this video right here. Also, don't forget to support Fin Fishing on this link. I will see you guys in the next one.